Hi everyone, hope you're doing well. My name is Sorsha Byrne and I'm the Free Legal Advice Committee's first year rep. I am beyond excited to be a part of FLAC this year, even during these unprecedented times, because of the important conversations that our virtual weekly panel discussions are able to bring. They are facilitated, though, with the help of our amazing panelists who are dedicating their time, efforts, knowledge, experience, and research to these discussions in order to aid our understanding of these important topics. This week we will be bringing to you an examination of the state of law regarding disability rights and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable persons. To do so, we have a lineup of speakers, starting with Dr. Meredith Raley, the Policy and Research Officer of the Disability Federation of Ireland. She will be discussing the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the public sector duty during the pandemic. Next up, we have Margaret Turley of Inclusion Ireland, who will be presenting her research that she co-authored and published on the experiences of adults with intellectual disabilities in Ireland during the COVID-19 crisis. And last but not least, we have Courtney McGrath, the founder of Ability Co-op, who will be discussing her experiences as a student with a disability, as well as providing information on supports available to other students. Hope you enjoy, and thank you so much again.
Hi, and thank you for asking me to speak today. My name is Dr. Meredith Raley, and I am a Research and Policy Officer at the Disability Federation of Ireland. We're an umbrella organization that looks to promote the better equality and the rights for people with disabilities. So today I'd like to talk about during this COVID crisis, how it's important to protect the rights of marginalized people, including people with disabilities, and how the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and the public sector duty play into protecting those rights. So first, the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, or UNCRPD. It is a human right. It is a United Nations Human Rights Convention that was ratified by Ireland in spring of 2018. Now, ratification does not mean that the UNCRPD is a law. Obviously, that would require a change to the Constitution to make a treaty a law. However, it does mean that Ireland has made a promise, both to the international community and to its own people, that it will respect the rights of people with disabilities and begin to incorporate the UNCRPD into its own laws and policies. Ireland was actually set to deliver a report on its progress implementing the UNCRPD to the United Nations in spring of this year, 2020. Now, somewhat understandably, given the situation this year, that has been delayed. The report has not yet been delivered, but it is a reminder that Ireland does have an obligation to continue making progress on the rights of people with disabilities, because it does have to, hopefully next year, report to the UN on what it has been doing around the UNCRPD. And that report at this time will likely take into account what was done during the COVID crisis. So if there was one phrase that would sum up what the UNCRPD says about the status of people with disabilities, it's a phrase that recurs over and over again in the UNCRPD, and that is the phrase, on an equal basis with others. So people with disabilities should be able to use public transport on an equal basis with others. They should be able to attend cultural events on an equal basis with others. To receive and disseminate information on an equal basis with others. And all that means, broken down, is in the same way as everyone else. So no extra steps, no extra hassles, no extra difficulties, to just be able to go out and do a thing in the same way that anyone else in Ireland might do it. And so that's kind of the standard we want to judge actions by. When we look at how an action affects people with disabilities, or how a law or a policy does, what we want to say is, does this mean that people with disabilities can do something in the same way as everyone else, or does it create extra steps or extra difficulties for them? The UNCRPD also upholds a principle that people with disabilities should always have a say in decisions that will affect them. This is the principle, if you've ever worked in any time around disability rights, you've heard the principle, nothing about us without us. Basically, people with disabilities should not have decisions made for them, as was so often the case in the past. They should be involved and actively consulted and participate in all decision-making around people with disabilities. So those are two of the sort of bedrock principles of the UNCRPD, and those are the ones we want to look at when we look at how the response to COVID in Ireland affected people with disabilities. Obviously, everyone in Ireland was greatly affected by the response to COVID. We were all affected by the lockdown, the shutdown of schools and universities. But what we want to look at is, were people with disabilities affected differently, or have they been affected in different ways in the way Ireland responded to the COVID crisis? So if we look at what the UNCRPD says about emergency health situations, there are sort of two articles that would be the guiding principles in that. There's Article 11. Article 11 looks at situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies, which certainly a global pandemic would qualify for that. And that one just says states must ensure the safety of people with disabilities in this without discrimination, in the same way they would ensure the safety of anyone else in a situation of risk. The other article that applies a lot in this situation is Article 25 on health. Now, Article 25 on health, what's significant in this case is it says that the state should help people with disabilities obtain the highest possible standard of health, and people with disabilities should receive health care without discrimination based on their disability. So the same level of health care as everyone else in the population. So the other sort of legal principle that applies in this case around disability and human rights and the COVID crisis is the public sector duty. So the public sector duty is also the public sector human rights and equality duty. This is a statutory responsibility. It's not a treaty. It's found in Section 42 of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission Act of 2014. So it's a principle that came in when the Equality Authority and the Human Rights Commission were combined into the current Human Rights and Equality Commission that we have at the moment. And this is a duty on all public bodies, so all government bodies and some bodies funded by government. And it requires these bodies to constantly take actions to eliminate discrimination, promote equality, and protect human rights. And these actions must cut across all 9 grounds found in the Equal Status Act, possibly soon to be 10 grounds, and that obviously includes disability. So the public sector duty and the UNCRPD interact quite a lot. If a public body is looking for actions around disability, then looking for ways to implement the UNCRPD is obviously a way to find action to take to improve equality and human rights for people with disabilities. And during the COVID crisis, IREC actually did issue a guidance note in which it informed government bodies and the public that the public sector duty was not suspended during this crisis. Obviously, actions had to be taken. Nobody was arguing with that. But IREC simply argued that those actions must still take into account the public sector duty, and they need to uphold equality and human rights principles. So how did the COVID crisis affect people with disabilities? And did it affect them differently than other people? Obviously, during the initial emergency measures, everyone was hugely affected. For people with disabilities, many services shut down. For children with disabilities, they, in many cases, stopped receiving special supports at school. And there has been concern about the long-term effects that these shutdowns had of both services and special provisions for children with disabilities in schools. And there are still concerns about how to properly support people with disabilities and children with disabilities during social distancing. But I think some of the things I've heard the most about have actually been much smaller things. A lot of the measures taken during the summer, when we were trying to reach some kind of new normal, are some of the most illustrative examples of how the COVID crisis affected people with disabilities differently than other people. So you might remember over the summer when the lockdowns were lifted and we were all trying to achieve some kind of normalcy, there were a lot of changes. Many local authorities made changes to how towns and cities were running. In many cases, new bike lanes were brought in, new pedestrian zones. Public transport was changed both during the lockdown and beyond, with new schedules perhaps, some bus stop changes to accommodate the new pedestrian zones and so forth. And what was striking about this, a new furniture on footpaths, many restaurants putting out tables in front of their restaurants on the footpaths, for instance. And what was striking about this was it was done very quickly, and it was done with almost no consultation with people with disabilities or consideration of how these changes would affect people with disabilities. If you are visually impaired or use a wheelchair or other mobility aids, obviously having new furniture on the footpath has a much greater effect on you. If you can imagine, think about walking down a street in the summer when there were tables out. Imagine trying to maneuver around those with a cane or a wheelchair. The new bike lanes were often installed without thoughts about how they affected existing bus stops or existing pedestrian crossings. And the changes to public transportation when bus stops were moved around to facilitate social distancing. I know many people worried if a bus stop that they used to get to their doctor had been moved, or if a bus schedule had been changed, how would that affect their ability to attend medical appointments? And what was striking was, it's not that these changes aren't welcome. I think many of us enjoyed dining outside in the summer, or using the new bike lanes. It's that the changes were undertaken without any consultation. People with disabilities weren't asked, how can we do this in a way that includes you in our society? And they weren't asked how they felt about these changes. Even past consultations, which made it clear that footpath furniture can be a problem, were ignored in this rush to try to find some kind of new normal ground for everyone, in a way that often excluded people with disabilities. So that sounds like a small example, but obviously if it's keeping you from getting to the shop or getting to your GP, it's actually a fairly large and life-changing example. So it's just a reminder that during this crisis, while we moved to try to both protect everyone and bring in a new kind of normalcy for everyone, it's very important that we take into account the rights and the needs of all people in society. And that in our rush to change things, even when things need to be changed fairly quickly, we don't forget the needs and the opinions of marginalized people, such as people with disabilities. All right, thank you for your time, and I hope this has been helpful.
Hello, my name is Margaret Turley. I was part of a team of 3 people who have intellectual disability and decided to do research into how people with IED are coping during the COVID pandemic. Just a little bit about myself. I graduated from the Trinity Centre in 2013, having won the Margaret McLaughlin Prize for Best Student. I have co-lectured Trinity third year social work students for 2 hours weekly, and I have a permanent part-time job with EY, Ernst & Young, business partners of Trinity. I have spoken at many conferences and been on national radio, giving advice to people with an intellectual disability. I have participated in 2 research projects before this one, and I learned a lot from the main people doing the research. One research project was 19 stories of social inclusion with Inclusion Ireland and the Department of Social Work at Trinity College. And the second was Education, Behaviour and Exclusion with Inclusion Ireland and Technical University Dublin. On these research projects, I worked with 2 other people with intellectual disability who were also on the research team, Tomas Murphy and Chris Bourne. As a result of our experience on these projects, we decided to do a research into the experience of adults with intellectual disabilities in Ireland during the COVID pandemic. We felt that nobody was checking in to see how people with ID are being affected by COVID, and that's why we took this project on. We asked Inclusion Ireland and TU Dublin if they would support us with this research. First, we had to prepare the questions we intended asking. We connected by Zoom and emails. It's my first time to use Zoom. When we had agreed them, we had to find people from all over the country with different ages, abilities, and situations to agree to answer the questions. I was able to use my Trinity contacts to ask some people. We then had to contact the agreed interviewees and record their contest to participate over Zoom. One person didn't want to be videoed. After that, we decided the interviewees between us and not to take the people that we knew ourselves. During the research took a bit of time and energy, but it was very rewarding. We got the support and lots of encouragement during this project from Inclusion Ireland and TU Dublin. I also feel it's important for people to know that people with ID can do this kind of research as they are living with ID themselves and understand it perfectly. I feel we can relate to the interviewees better as we are one of them. We are the experts in this area. In the past, research of this kind was done by other experts who did not have ID. I think this video speaks for itself, and I hope you all enjoy the fruits of our labor as much as we enjoy doing this. And here is a copy of our research that we did, and it's on Inclusion Ireland's website.
Hello, I am Courtney McGrath. I am a final year business and sociology student studying in Trinity College. I will be discussing my personal experience in education as a student with a disability. I will also be discussing the supports available for students with disabilities and how lecturers can best support them. I am profoundly deaf and have bilateral cochlear implants. I rely heavily on lip reading and I usually cannot hear what lecturers say, so I struggled a lot in first year. When I started, I had a needs assessment meeting with the Disability Service and discussed the supports available to me. However, as I was still finding my way around college, I didn't consider some supports such as note takers and did not want to draw attention to myself by having a note taker in my class. After receiving my grades at the end of first year, I did quite poorly, and which I knew I did need a note taker. I was able to meet with the Disability Service and change my supports that best suited my needs. My journey through education as a student with disability may be considered smoother than others. Still, it wasn't until an incident during my exam in second year where the exam invigilator was hovering over around my desk for 30 minutes, which got me thinking about students with anxiety. How would they react during an exam with the exam invigilator hovering over them? I started talking to other students with disabilities about their negative encounters with lecturers or the lack of supports available to them on Erasmus. It opened my eyes that students with disabilities needs are nearly pushed to the side, and that was fine because it wouldn't be like us to stand up for ourselves. A group of students with disabilities who have previously had negative encounters with college staff and students with regards to their disabilities created the Trinity Ability Co-op to ensure inclusion is taken seriously. In the Trinity Ability Co-op, we share different stories from different students with disabilities about their disabilities, their needs, their story, and basically their life, just to get disabilities to be taken seriously and inform people of different supports that students do need. Students with disabilities in Trinity can avail of supports from the Disability Service that is best suited to their learning needs. After the needs assessment, each student will have a LENS report, which is a learning educational needs support document, and the information of the LENS report is made available to relevant staff within the university, such as teaching staff, disability service personnel, and your tutor, and this will help them provide you assistance. On the Disability Service website, there is important information about reasonable accommodations. A reasonable accommodation, as it is referred to in the Equal Status Act, is an amendment to the student's course of study which enables them to participate fully in their education. An adjustment is intended to help ensure disabled students are not at a disadvantage, available to students with specific learning difficulties and other disabilities, intended to address a disability-related issue, not an ability gap. As per the Trinity Reasonable Accommodation Policy, the academic, teaching, learning and assessment responsibilities within this policy lie primarily within the relevant school's director of teaching and learning, undergraduate and postgraduate as appropriate, or program course director. All academic staff and organisers of departmental examinations are responsible for ensuring they reasonably accommodate students with disabilities as outlined in the LENS report disseminated to them in SITs. There have been incidents where lecturers do not look at students' LENS report or do not provide supports outlined in the documentation. This means they are not upholding their end to the policy, and this needs to change, or students with disabilities will be left behind. The Trinity Ability Co-op at the start of the summer did a video on the feedback of online learning, which addressed some issues and praises for the new way of learning. For me, the online platforms such as Blackboard, Collaborate and Zoom do not have subtitles, which means I will miss out what is said in class. Alternatively, for different students, classes online were a good thing, as they may have a mobility disability or have to attend medical appointments where they may have to miss class, and now they can watch recorded lectures whenever they can. Society was rapid to move everything online for the coronavirus, but having this option available for people with disabilities seemed impossible. And this supporting people with disabilities should not be an afterthought. Lecturers can best support students with disabilities during this time by properly considering LENS reports, being empathetic for students during this time, and be flexible with changing their teaching styles to ensure students with disabilities are not left behind. Thank you.